Welcome to another episode of One Idea Away, where we're committed to living more fully, deeply, and consciously. Why? Because when we do, we're calmer, we're clearer, we're more connected, more joyful, and much more alive. On this show, we bring you stories of those that are figuring it out just like us, as well as experts who can shed light on the hows and the whys all of this stuff works. So I want to thank you all for tuning in and sharing and reviewing our show. If you haven't done so yet, please drop us a review. Also, subscribe to the podcast on our feed, whether it's on iTunes or whatever app you happen to be using. And if there's something that stands out in the show, do us a favor. If it makes you think of somebody, share it along, because this show is meant to get the conversation started, not just to drop in for a little inspiration. So with that, let's turn to this week's episode. Today's episode is sponsored by, well, us, One Idea Away, and very specifically by the 10 Days to Connection Challenge. You see, we ran this really interesting experience for our community in a slightly smaller way to bring people into greater connection with themselves, to clear away the mental clutter, to detox their hearts so they could be more open and free with the experience of life that they were having. And it went amazing. We received such incredible feedback about how wonderful this process was and how freeing it was for people to really connect to life in a deeper way and move past all the stress and the chatter and all the things that distract us on a day-to-day type of basis that ultimately disconnect us from who we truly are and the life that we love. And so this 10 Days Connection Challenge is meant to help you clear that clutter, that mental chatter that keeps you from connecting to that happier life. It helps you to create the space that you deserve to simply take a breath, to uncover what makes you happy, and to let go of anything that isn't working. You get to detox your mind, detox your heart, and connect to that life that you wish to experience, and learn how to bring it out more in you and in everything that you experience on a day in and day out basis. It's just 5 to 10 minutes a day for a week and a half, and it's one of the most beneficial things you can do for yourself to create that space that you need to connect to the life that's waiting for you. Just go over to oneideaway.com/connect. That's oneideaway.com/connect. And I look forward to joining you there. And this week, I want to thank Janet B. for her submission, her request for this week's riff. Janet had written in to us about the idea that many people seem to be resisting and even promoting the idea of not feeling those negative emotions, meaning trying to feel the positive just all of the time. And that seems to be a pressure that's out there. A lot of people struggle with that idea of how is it that I then deal with? How do I wrestle with? How do I release? How do I work through these particular negative emotions? And there's a lot of different techniques. One of the ones that Janet raised was EFT, which is emotional freedom technique. There are other techniques like mindfulness and meditation and compassion work, all sorts of different ways that allow us ultimately to work through our emotions. But I wanted to address this issue of kind of blocking negative emotions, because it's one of the things that, depending on your family history, most typically, but certainly in your background, the people that were most influential and impactful on you, what were the ways in which they worked through emotions? Was it something that emotions were tucked away? Were they not meant to be felt? Were they meant to be hidden? Were they too difficult for people to deal with? Were those the sticky situations that we tried to avoid? Or did we try to kind of keep them down and suppress them so that we could, keep a stiff upper lip, as it were? So you want to think a little bit about what is your background, what's your kind of your emotional heritage, I guess you could consider, to figure out what might be some of the patterns that maybe you've taken on. Now, there's one of two different things that could happen from the negative standpoint in terms of that emotional heritage that we have. Well, the one is that we can be conditioned to follow that pattern, meaning to continue the pattern, that legacy of how it is that emotions are handled, perhaps in a manner that is not healthy. The other is that we swing to the opposite, meaning that it's, I'm not going to do it that way. I'll do it completely different than my mom, my dad, my cousin, my brother, my sister, my whatever, right? And so we actually end up swinging in the complete opposite direction, and that doesn't necessarily mean that that's healthy either. It could be, but those tend to be the kind of the two different extremes of how we treat our emotional heritage. And what we're looking for is really what are the best, most appropriate and healthy ways for us to be able to process our emotions in a manner that serves us. So here's what I wanted to address. You see, this is something I can actually speak to with a kind of a great deal of personal experience through kind of my emotional heritage, as it were. Actually, not so much so in terms of a reflection on anything I experienced from family life per se, but it was more just a result of upbringing where we happened to have a fire in my house at a very, very young age. We lost everything, and I became very, very serious overnight. And as part of that, one of the ways that I developed as a protection mechanism was that emotions were scary. Emotions were things that didn't make me feel good. They were brought up a lot of fear, which kind of came back to that original, childhood experience of losing our home in a fire. And so for many, many years, I did whatever I could to effectively, essentially suppress those types of emotions. A lot of people would look at me and say, wow, he seems to be really calm, cool, and collected for most of my life. Seems really reserved. Seems like he's kind of on top of it. He knows what he's doing. Honestly, all that was going on was I was just holding everything back. And it was just a matter of time before that caught up to me. And certainly it ultimately did. And that was actually ultimately a good thing. It was a great catalyst for me to be able to work through and do many of the things that I get to do today. But here's the way that I want you to take a look at this. You see, when for some reason, maybe it's because of the happiness movement, as it were, that's out there. There's a misconception that means that we're trying to move ourselves towards happy or towards some form of positive state of mind at all times. And number one, that's just simply not realistic. But number two is that actually essentially tells us that some of the more challenging emotions that we may feel, whether that's anything from things like anger and frustration, even resentment, to things like sadness and sorrow and grief, it almost tells us that those things are bad in some way, that they're not part of the human experience. And it's not to say that we want to spend a tremendous amount of time there. It's not necessarily fun to be in those types of situations, but it is part of life. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with experiencing some of those ups and downs. As a matter of fact, it kind of broadens our emotional range and our emotional experience to be able to work through that vast range of things that are challenging and quote unquote negative, as it were, and those other positive feeling type of states that are more maybe pleasant or desirable for us to be able to have. But we don't want to get stuck in this idea that we've got to push away from these things that cause us to not feel so good. When we do that, what happens is that we can be blocking those emotions from coming up, meaning that we could really be stifling them, really kind of bottling them up, as it were. We could be pushing away and resisting them so that it's almost like everything from just kind of turning the blind eye to just immediately trying to get away from anything that doesn't necessarily feel good. That ultimately could be just an avoidance, meaning to distract yourself from emotions that are not so comfortable. I want to come back to that one in just a second. It can also mean that we shift ourselves too quickly, meaning that we try to reframe, we try to move on, and we actually miss so much of the experience and any of the insights and messages and learnings that can come from that experience, which are a really good thing. There's a lot that we can learn through that so-called stress or distress even that we may go through. We don't want to stay there. But there's a lot there that actually can be a good thing for us in terms of building resiliency, in terms of building ourselves, in terms of building that emotional range and experience and fortitude and those types of things. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing. Now, I wanted to come back to this idea of avoiding or distracting ourselves from some of our emotional states, because I actually think this is one that's kind of really on the rise and maybe even more prevalent than it ever has been before. Because of things like everything from, distraction can be related to substance abuse, and that could be drugs, it could be alcohol, it could be anything along those lines, it could be cigarettes, whatever. But it also can be things like TV and binge watching, flipping and scrolling from one Netflix film to the next, or binge watching the TV series. It can be our social media and our smartphones. People talk about the excessiveness of screen time and quite literally the social media and smartphone addictions that we have, right on down to the point that we get a little dopamine fix when we get those notifications. We're getting trained like Pavlov's dogs to respond to our notifications on our phones. Well, with all of these different distractions that are around us and all of these different ways of moving our attention away from what it is that we're not, may not have us feeling good, it moves us away from wrestling through and working through what's really going on. So very often when people are struggling in a particular situation, it could be that something is not really comfortable for them within their jobs. It could be that something is unsettling to them within their relationships, within their home life, whether that be with a partner or a spouse or their children. It could be something that's going on maybe with a very close friend, as it were, or sibling in that type of regard. Whenever there's a situation within our lives that we're really struggling with, and it's almost to the point of a little bit overwhelming to a lot overwhelming, we don't really know where it's going to go. We don't have the clarity. We don't yet have the know-how of how we're going to move ourselves forward. What can happen is that we then turn to that distraction because we don't want to feel those uncomfortable emotions. We don't want to feel the confusion and the ambiguity and the uncertainty, because that then brings up fear and doubt and anxieties and worries and all these types of things. And so we numb ourselves. And so any of the types of things of blocking emotions, bottling them up, stifling them, distracting ourselves from them, resisting, it's different ways of us pushing away or even numbing ourselves from those types of experiences. That ultimately is going to obviously be extremely detrimental to us. One of the anxiety is one of those things that is so heavily on the rise inside of our society. It's something that so many people feel in a whole range, a whole spectrum of intensities. Well, part of what anxiety is related to is that anxiety comes up due to previously unfelt feelings, things that have not been worked through. So when they begin to accumulate, they begin to kind of, build up and layer up over time, there's this unsettled part of you that just stays there, and that builds ultimately into that anxiety. And so we certainly don't want to do that. Both, that same type of process creates an accumulation of stress inside of our systems, which ultimately is going to have a serious physical consequence on us as well. And not to mention that if we're trying to block or push away or resist or avoid or shift quickly, that takes a lot of effort. It's exhausting. I don't know about you. I remember it used to be really draining when I used to do that, as opposed to just being where I was and feeling whatever it was that was going on for me, let alone the fact that actually created a richer life for me. Like I said, that broader emotional experience and range. But when we need that constant effort, it's like a constant vigilance where we're always trying to move ourselves to feel better, to feel good. When every once in a while, it's okay to just be where you are. If you're not feeling well on a particular day, fine. Just be there. Just experience it. Because when we try to stifle it or move it around or distract ourselves, we may be able to briefly move it out of that emotional center that is maybe our heart and our gut that we most typically will feel these feelings in. We may move it away from there, but we're going to usually keep ruminating on it. It's going to sting in our heads. We may be able to distract ourselves for 37 minutes binge watching a series or an episode of a series or what have you, but it's going to come back and it's going to be there and it's going to linger around the mind because the mind knows that it is not settled. It has not been wrestled with yet. So the mind is going to keep bringing it up over and over and over again. Well, when we allow the thought behind the emotion to ruminate within our head, meaning whatever that emotional experience, whatever that experience is saying to us, the phrases, the concerns, the worries, the thoughts that race through our head, ultimately that can turn to rumination, and that actually can create a really negative spiral where we tend to get stuck within that perception. We get stuck within that frame of reference. We start to see more things as related to that particular stressor. Why? Because it's literally on our minds and it clouds the way that we see life. It clouds the perspective that we have. So there's so many reasons why we want to be able to feel our feelings. So a few points on that. What we're talking about is, and there's many ways to do this. So on the one hand, yes, it could literally mean just feeling it. It doesn't mean taking action on that feeling. It doesn't mean that you got to go do something about that feeling. At times it can be literally just taking 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. It might take a little longer for more intense things on a given day. But part of the reason why they last is we don't just sit down for those 5, 10, or 15 minutes and feel them. Feel what it's like to be there for a moment. Feel what it's like within your body. To get a sense of what's actually there and allow it to work through. Emotions are meant to rise and then fall away. But if we stifle the rise, then it knows that it's incomplete. It knows that it's unfinished. We need to allow it to move through. Again, it doesn't mean you take action. If you're feeling the frustration and resentment and anger, we certainly don't want to take action from that place. It only leads, frankly, to more stress and more problems and more negative feelings in that regard. So we want to allow this to be able to work ourselves through. And it means that we need some healthy habits to be able to do so. So it could be 5 to 10 to 15 minutes, let's say, of giving yourself that chance on your own during a walk or during a meditation. It's some quiet time, maybe even during an exercise routine. Typically one that's a little bit slower, so you actually have the chance to be present to what you're feeling and not just distracted away from what it is you're feeling. But anything that allows you that time to be able to work through and feel whatever it is that's going on for you. That number one is also, that's, kind of first and foremost, very, very important. The second thing is to figure out what else is going to continue to help it to release. Now, what they've shown through a variety of different studies, and most of this was originally associated with writing and journaling type of work, was that when we write about our negative experiences, the experiences that really bring up those tougher and more difficult feelings that we have, when we write about them, and even just over, I'm talking like 10, 15 minutes a day for like 3-4 days in a row. Okay. The original study was 20 minutes a day for 4 days in a row. That was the original study. They found that it actually has an impact if you even write in less time. But let's say, give or take 15 minutes a day for 3 to 4 days, you're going to write on some of the challenging experiences, whatever it is. Journal about whatever you're feeling right now, whatever you're working yourself through. The other thing you can do is you can also do an audio journal, because you can talk it out. The key part is that you're getting it out. You're letting it out of your system. That's a really important part of this, because that actually allows the feeling to be even further, the emotion to be even further released. And then most of the time, you're going to find one of two things. One, probably going to start to feel a little better. It's almost like a little bit of pressure has been let out, okay? And not in a way that creates more pressure or creates more ramifications, but done in a really healthy way. Just a little teapot blown off steam, but on its own, not at somebody, let's say. The other thing that it's going to do is that sometimes it also starts to give you some insight and learning as to what was it that triggered you? What was it that really bothered you? And sometimes it's just, you know what? I was sad because of the loss of a situation, the loss of a career, the loss of somebody close to me. It could be something along those lines. It could be that there's insight to getting triggered where you were very frustrated or defiant or really struggled with something that was coming up. And you can also start to inquire, wonder what was that was about? Did an honor, did a value not get honored? Did a need not get met? What was it that brought that up in me? We can't usually get to that level of insight or wisdom when we haven't yet felt the emotion, because that too also ends up staying bottled up. So the more and more that we can learn how to emotionally process what it is that we are going through, it ultimately makes us much more healthy individuals. It strengthens our well-being. It strengthens our emotional resiliency. It actually is what allows us to move back to those more positive experiences more quickly, because we've let go of the things that otherwise would have held us back. And I guess the last thing on that is just, it also enriches your experience. Like I said, this idea of us getting a broader emotional range, it means we get to experience more of life and recognize that that whole range, it's not always pleasant, it's not always easy, but it is life. And we can have appreciation for that. And we can value all of the experiences that we have, no matter what they happen to be, even the ones that are really challenging. So the more and more that we face our emotions, the more and more that we learn to work through even some of those negative emotions, the more healthy we will be, the more connected we will be to ourselves, first and foremost, the more that our best self will get put forward in the rest of our lives, and the more that ultimately will have benefit on the relationships that are around us, one of the most important things for nearly everyone out there. So I hope this has been helpful. I hope it gives you a few ideas. Matter of fact, if you want to learn how to even do this even a little bit deeper, a little bit better, if you haven't already participated in one of the 10 days to connection experiences and challenges that we run, do me a favor and log on to that, because we actually handle some of this as part of that process as well. Just go over to oneideaaway.com/connect. And you'll be able to sign up for the next connection challenge, because we run them on a recurring basis. And so thanks everybody for tuning in to this week's Riff. I hope this has been helpful. And until next time, much love. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you really enjoyed it, do me a favor, let us know. You can keep the conversation going and send us a message on our Facebook page, which is simply One Idea Away. Go ahead and tag me in the post, or even just direct messages. Also, I would be incredibly grateful if you could share this episode along with someone that you believe could benefit from hearing the ideas and the messages that we got into. That's pretty much why we do this. So you can just go ahead and share it from your app or email it along, whatever works for you. The point is to share, to talk, to discuss, and keep the dialogue going, because it's in those conversations that ideas can take hold and create profound shifts in perspective. That's what allows us to live life more fully, deeply, and consciously. As always, we would love to see you post a review for the podcast in iTunes or whichever app you're using. And until next time, remember, you're never more than one idea away from a whole new reality. This is Luke Iorio and One Idea Away, signing off.